This treatment, this discussion this afternoon really follows the dictum that we want to get the right patient for the right treatment at the right time. And we have some people talking about some technology tools that are often used in practice, as well as some that are on the horizon that we may find is helpful in our practice. My name is Steve Knighkus. I'm a psychiatrist, and I've been in this area for many, many years, and in fact have been a proponent for some time of looking out and trying to identify practices that are used perhaps in other specialties, technology or tools that we can quickly customize and apply to our patients. We're going to start off with George Carpenter, who is the CEO of Mind Analytics. They used to be CNS Response. George has really done a great job in rebuilding this company and being able to make that tool of technology available to us. He's been in the healthcare industry for some time and has done and been in that way also developed other tools and capabilities that we need in practice. Full disclosure, I use his test often in my practice. As a retired Army doctor, I treat a number of veterans and soldiers, victims of torture and abuse, as well as patients who have very complicated medical conditions. So these are people that have been traumatized, they have PTSD, depression, concussions, exposed to blasts, Lyme disease, sleep problems, and it really becomes confounding trying to find the right medication. And the patients are often reluctant when you say to them, look, here's what you need to do. It's very, very helpful to have an objective instrument like what George's company provides to then be able to rationally speak to these people and explain to them why a particular medication is going to be used at a particular time. So it's a great pleasure. George, actually, I don't know if I've got the facts right, but I think George is a Dartmouth College graduate, close or in the class of Stephen Colbert. So you've got a mark now, and it's after lunch, so we want to be all enthralled.
Okay, great. Let the fun begin. So I've been in healthcare for a long time, which means I've made all the mistakes possible. But I should start right off the bat with kind of this part of Shark Tank where we talk about what happened since the last time when Mark Cuban invested. We were actually at Brain Futures 2 years ago in November of 2015. It was fantastic. And it was like now, all the best kind of leading people are there. And since then, it really kind of turned us around. We got a lot of attention. We had on Veterans Day last year, Jake Tapper did a great CNN story as we had announced our military data. And he actually did the EEG himself. He would not take it off. He wore it like the whole day around the newsroom. And we've started up work with the Canadian military, with the Veterans Administration. We've had a number of institutions approach us, and our first commercial payer now in New Jersey. So Henry Harbin loves it when you explain exactly what the heck you do right off the bat. So pretty much the most important 2 minutes are right now. I'll tell you everything. We take EEG, standard 1020, 21 lead EEG, and we run it through quantitative EEG. We use NeuroGuide, and we compare that to a huge registry of people with actual outcomes. 10,700 patients who we followed for an average of 405 days. So these are durable therapeutic yes-no outcomes that we followed them for. And we get about 38,000 outcomes from those almost 11,000 people. And we correlate that. So we correlate their outcomes with an objective reference test like EEG, and we're able to say the kind of brain that looks like a non-responder to an SSRI, and specifically to Lexapro, is this kind of brain. And we're able to do that with machine learning. And it wasn't invented by me. It was invented by a group of doctors in California and a network of doctors like Michael Anderson here in DC who contributed their outcomes toward this effort. So it's a great way to think of kind of crowdsourcing, open data, citizen science, coming up with a huge resolution of a problem. And the problem is trial and error medicine. There's nothing on the label that says which brain Lexapro is going to work in. We're actually able to guide doctors with a 35 drug evoked set of psychotropics that are commonly used down to maybe 5 or 10 that are most likely to work for the brain that's in your office right now. And that's a huge thing. That has a 3 times better efficacy impact. And what we saw in the military studies and another commercial study was reduced suicidality. Every drug in this category is black box labeled for suicidal ideation. So if you can improve the shots on goal and the hit rate, you can have a big difference. The evidence for this, we just had the Stanford group finishing up a clinical dossier, and their conclusions were, if you look at the thing on the right, the red line is the effect size of all of our 4 randomized trials, and they said this qualifies as strong effect. More than 1 is strong effect, we're 1.1. They also rated all of the treatment as usual drug studies that were submitted to the FDA, positive and negative. The average for those was between 0.31 and 0.41. So we're looking at 3 times improvement in efficacy, and that's a pretty significant effect, let alone the fact that all of our studies have been positive and successful and consistent. There are plenty of other people, 21 other randomized trials, 73 observational studies, about 5,000 in all of these studies. So we're beginning to see, with things like Brain Futures and other rigorous evaluations of science, big data approaching the ability to do what small data, 1 or 200 N CNS trials, are trying to do. And that's an exciting time. It's just a really exciting time to be in science and be able to do this commercially. So what does it look like on the ground as a practitioner? You and the patient agree that you want data. This is data that doctors do want. You do the EEG, and as you know, EEG is a relatively inexpensive, typically reimbursed procedure that can be done in the office, and the signals are on 4 channels, alpha, beta, delta, theta. And once you run it through quantitative EEG, you can actually get, as you saw in the previous presentation, some really good diagnostic and symptomatic information about the patient. We don't do that. That is NeuroGuide in this example. And if you superimpose it on a brain with Loretta, you can actually show something that looks a lot like a functional MRI or a PET scan. And I'll tell you, patients really appreciate, like if they're in one of our centers, they really like being able to see something in their brain. No doctor has ever touched them or measured their brain, typically when they're a refractory patient with depression and they've had it for 20 years and had maybe 3 or 4 different drugs. We then compare it to this large database in the cloud. So we collect outcomes and we characterize brains and drugs. And then the one thing that's wrong with that picture is we're not a black box. We publish all of our data. Part of being a licensee or a subscriber is you're contributing data and you get to see every drug model we've got. And our goal isn't to own all the data. Our goal is to be the Google of neuroscience, where you come to us because you want the most current data. The quarterly release now has a different slope of the line for Lexapro than the last quarter's release. And so publishing all of our data allows us to do what machine learning does so well, and you've seen this in the literature. You can take a bunch of feature sets from EEG, you pick 1, 3, and 5, you train a model to recognize that feature set, and then you test that model on unseen data. It can be new data, it could be 10% of the data that you held out of the equation from your existing data set. And you do that cross-validation over and over again so you can understand what the predictive accuracy is. And then you compare it against treatment as usual. And like I said, we've had 4 randomized trials now. There's other people who've replicated the same data. Now, because one of my mentors is Jay Lombard, and he's going to tell you about pharmacogenomics, we really believe that. And we use kind of the crudest genomic findings for CYP 450 to also make sure that maybe if we're wrong, if we're 0.91 predictive, but we're wrong 10% of the time, maybe we were right, but the drug never got to your brain. So we also add that to the discriminants, and that's helpful. The process ends with a report that doctors can read basically in 2 pages, or they can read on their iPad, and they get it the same day that the patient showed up in their office. And so they're able to see, it's red, white, and blue, because the military, we thought it would be patriotic. And basically, blue is where you want to be. If it's more favorable response by class and by individual medication. So you can see in this example, MAOIs are the leading class, and the class discriminant is really a pretty good quality model. Well, no doctor in their right mind uses an MAOI because they were taught in medical school you could kill yourself with a cheese pizza or a beer because there's a fermentation reaction that happens and you could have a tyramine crisis and die. Okay, there are at least 2 drugs that don't have that problem in the class, selegiline and the oral and the patch. So they did that at Walter Reed, and they had some miracles where they gave people a drug they never would have arrived at had this report not existed, and they applied this, and fortunately they did pay for the patch, which was expensive. But you're talking about people who are severe. In fact, we did in the Walter Reed trial something you never do. We included people with active suicidality in a clinical trial. That, you're betting the farm. But they asked us to, and we thought it was our duty to do, so we did it. And that's where I think we got some of the result with suicidality and the fact that we got people on drugs that they never would have arrived at earlier. So I'm going to shift and spend the next 2 minutes on what happens when you come up with a solution that people aren't expecting. And you have this from Moneyball, which is basically the Red Sox owner explaining why if you show somebody statistics that allow them to completely reframe their business, a lot of times they're not going to like that. And a lot of times they're going to fight it. And it's easier to blame the data than it is to actually adopt something. So not so different here. You've got a $21 billion drug category where 17 million people are walking around having failed 2 drugs and a cost of $8,500 per patient per year for the payers to be able to get there. Trivedi says, hey, we're no better than flipping a coin, but that is our model today, is flipping a coin. And Dr. Insel said the same thing. So basically, we're in this situation where the research is ambiguous. You've got studies that say antidepressants don't work, the work of Kirsch and others, it's mainly placebo effect. And then you've got other folks saying, well, actually, the new meta-analysis published a couple of weeks ago says that they do work. But then Kirsch fires back, well, it's a minuscule standard mean difference. So we don't know what the right answer is. Frankly, we don't care. What we do know is that doctors with objective data that guide them to a smaller evoked set of drugs do way better, 3 times better in efficacy, and probably reduce risk. Now, who would you expect to solve the problem? Elliot Spitzer. Okay, not the scandal you're thinking, the other scandal where he said, I'm going to sue Glaxo for not publishing negative trials and all the other pharmas. So in 2004, he said, no, now you got to publish the negative trials. Oops, there's lots of negative trials. In fact, there's only 3 drugs that have more positive than negative trials based on the equivalent data that they submitted to the FDA. So I think we're getting a lot better with big data, just identifying what the true population results are. STAR-D we thought was a successful trial. Now, well, there was a high relapse rate and remission wasn't so good. As to the point that General Corelli made, there's only 2 on-label drugs for PTSD. Both of them had more negative trials that they spent a lot of money on that proved that it didn't work than positive trials. So, one of the advantages of this is we can get doctors away from prescribing the most recently marketed drug, which are the SSRIs, the most recent Super Bowl commercials, and onto drugs, instead of just serially marching through those, onto drugs that actually work. So the Walter Reed data I shared, 144% better efficacy, but 75% less suicidality. And we think with a very severe population, those are data that are likely to obtain. But the thing nobody expected was people actually stayed in treatment. 5 visits out of a possible 6 over 6 months versus 2. And this isn't just the control group. Across the armed services, they measure the data. The average number of behavioral visits is 2. Nobody gets better in 2 visits. So we think there's real power in those numbers and in continuing to collect them. In fact, since we were at Walter Reed, we've added 2,200 more patients, and we went from 86% accurate to 91%. So we think there's a lot of power in big data. That is where I will end. I've already talked about the other trials. And the thought to leave you with is what happens to all of us when the computers get smarter than we are. My car is already smarter than I am. But what happens when these become data? And our argument would be that allows us to move forward, to reach higher, to do better things with our lives than trial and error medicine. So
Thanks, George.
I'll turn it over.
Appreciate it. Very good. We're going to run through these presentations, give 5 minutes between these 2 and then Dr. Richards for a quick Q&A. And hopefully the audience can participate. So now we have Dr. Jay Lombard. He is the co-founder and the chief science officer for Genomind, a practicing neurologist. And glad to have you here and to show us what you've been working with.
I'm also George's mentor.
Oh,
Yes, exactly.
all right.
Exactly.
Okay. So I want to change gears a little bit, and first of all, thank you for being here. I'm going to try to sort of bring this to a point that is user-friendly for everybody. But one of the biggest breakthrough findings that occurred in psychiatry, as far as genetics are, is twofold. One is that we all have brains. We've now realized that every patient has a brain. I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek because I think that we forget that psychiatric diseases are brain-based disorders, just like any other condition that we treat in medicine. But when we say that psychiatric disease is a brain-based disorder, what actually do we mean by that concept? And when I lecture to psychiatrists, how many psychiatrists are in the room right now, by the way? Are there? So wow, it's about a half dozen that are here. I like to say that you guys are cardiologists of the brain. I say, what do you mean you're a cardiologist of the brain? Well, what you're treating in most situations are what are called ion channel dysfunctionality. So if you remember your basic biology, you know, our brains are exceedingly complex, but neurons are not that complex. Neurons have this sort of binary phenomena where they're either activated or they're quiescent and they're not firing and making action potentials. That effect occurs through ion channels. Ion channels depolarize neurons. So from basic biology, remember that sodium or calcium enters into neurons to excite the cell, or potassium leaves the cell to actually to reduce the action potential. Very, very simple, basic biology. How does that connect to genetics and psychiatry? What's been discovered, and by the way, this research is not my own research, is from many, many people at Sinai, at Harvard, and others, that regardless of your psychiatric diagnosis, whether you're diagnosed with PTSD, bipolar, depression, or autism, that it's much more common to have an ion channel dysfunction than if you are a person who doesn't have a psychiatric disease. So that tells us something very, very exciting, and that is that from a pure physiological perspective, if we drill down and keep asking ourselves the question, what are the underlying physiological changes that characterize psychiatric disorders in general, they're very similar to what we see in cardiology. That is that there is a homeostasis, a rhythm, if you will, that neurons have between excitation and inhibition, and that whether it's genetic bases or environmental bases, that stability of ion channels that regulate depolarization and hyperpolarization becomes imbalanced in a way that phenomenologically appears as symptoms such as bipolar. Okay, so I hope that's clear because it's a very, very exciting finding. And when I talk about this, I don't know if I'm the only person getting excited about it because to me it's one of the most important findings in psychiatry. And the question is, how do we, and this, by the way, just goes through a lot of the science. Calcium is one of those ions that when it enters into cells actually depolarizes the neuron. And here is some of the early data that showed that regardless of what your psychiatric diagnosis was, that there are abnormalities in these ion channels that characterize the physiological changes that are occurring in brains of patients with psychiatric disease. What does that mean clinically? Okay, it means that when you see a patient with bipolar or schizophrenia or PTSD, that we're sort of stuck into this this categorical model, right? Where the DSM says, oh, you have 5 out of 6 diagnoses, symptoms, you must have bipolar. Oh, you only have 4 out of 6, maybe you're schizoaffective, maybe you're PTSD with anxious symptoms. And we have to move out of the framework of giving patients these labels and thinking that there has to be a certain threshold of symptoms that are arbitrary to give a person a diagnosis, otherwise you can't medicate them or get insured by reimbursement. So I don't know if Dr. Insel's here, but one of the major contributions he made to this whole idea of psychiatry was let's move away from this categorical, arbitrary model of diagnosis and think of psychiatric disease as being dimensional. Being dimensional, meaning that patients, regardless of what the diagnosis is, have common pathophysiological mechanisms that we can begin addressing them biologically based upon the specificity of those biological mechanisms as opposed to just giving them a diagnosis. Oh, you're bipolar, you need Lamictal. Oh, you're not bipolar, we're going to give you an SSRI. Okay, so this is what the gene data actually shows us. There's other ion channels besides the calcium channel that's been determined to also be associated with these conditions. There's a sodium channel gene variant and other gene variants. Now, clinically, how many of you are actually treating patients as opposed to just, curious onlookers here? So, as a neurologist, I always would train my residents in saying, look, don't diagnose a problem if you don't have a solution for that problem. Don't look for something if you don't have an answer for that problem, right? So what is the value of genetics in psychiatry? To me, it's twofold. One, it informs us about basic physiology, so we understand root causes of psychiatric disease. And two, we get a lot more specificity regarding how to treat those patients. And that's why I say that we need to think of ourselves as cardiologists of the brain, because what drugs are most commonly used in psychiatry are drugs that are ion channel drugs. They're drugs that actually stabilize these channels to normalize this dysfunction. Lamictal, lithium, Depakote, Neurontin, all these medications are examples of drugs that stabilize ion channels. So a patient presents to you with symptoms that you may label as being bipolar, schizophrenic, or autism, but if you understand the pathophysiology being related to a biological impairment of ion channels, you can be much more specific in your treatment, not only pharmacologically, but also nutraceutically. So I'm a big believer. I've been in practice for 20 years. I've always used integrative medicine in my practice as a neurologist. I wrote books way too ahead of my time thinking about using omega-3 fatty acids for depression. But finally, we actually has become more mainstream for many psychiatrists and other doctors to think about using things that are non-pharmaceutical but are very, very safe, number one. And number two, may have antidepressant effects that are different than the antidepressant effects of SSRIs, for instance. So omega-3 fish oil, we actually don't know its main mechanism of why it's an antidepressant, but we do know that there's lots of meta-analyses that show that omega-3 fish oil does have antidepressant effects in subsets of patients. Not everybody across the board, but clearly there's an effect size to that. And the theories of how omega-3 fatty acids work is by acting as ion channel stabilizers. Okay, so the cardiologists were the first to discover that high dose of omega-3 fatty acids can reduce cardiac arrhythmias. Same concept. The omega-3 fatty acid stabilizes the ion channel, and that may be its mechanism. So lots of animal data that this overexpression of these ion channels in psychiatric disease leads to this state of behavioral symptoms like irritability, paroxysmal sleep problems, mania. Cyclical disorders is essentially corresponding to this ion channel dysregulation. Now, besides omega-3 fatty acids, this is a meta-analysis that was done by a number of people, including John Mann at Columbia. I don't think we should leave here thinking that omega-3 fatty acids are at the level of efficacy of a standard, FDA-approved medication for psychiatric disease. However, there is absolutely no contraindication unless a patient is on, anticoagulants or something that may interfere with their bleeding, that a person should not consider omega-3 fatty acids as part of their overall health. And it's, I think that we need to not be so afraid of these types of interventions, especially when you have a wealth of data showing that there is efficacy for compounds like omega-3 fatty acids for depression. Vitamin D is another compound that has lots of effects beyond its bone metabolism. It's been shown to actually help reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. There have been meta-analysis studies of low vitamin D being associated with cognitive dysfunction. So people are looking at how does vitamin D work in the brain? How is it a neuroprotective compound? One of its mechanisms is that vitamin D acts to stabilize these ion channels. It's an endogenous calcium channel inhibitor. Okay, so another thing where we're coupling altered physiology and psychiatry to non-pharmaceutical agents that actually operate to address those ion channels as opposed to just throwing out an antidepressant without knowing what that medication is doing to the brain directly. So here's some meta-analyses of vitamin D studies. Lots of data. Again, I don't want to give you the impression that I'm telling you that you should use vitamin D for depression. I'm trying to explain that there are compounds and things available to psychiatrists beyond just what the FDA approves. Almost done. Okay, so there's a vitamin D study. N-acetylcysteine is an amino acid that's been looked at in a number of clinical conditions, including OCD and addiction. N-acetylcysteine has several mechanisms that we think are effective in psychiatry. One of them is it acts as an anti-glutamate compound. So again, a lot of psychiatric drugs are glutamate antagonists. They block excitation by reducing excessive glutamate on neurons. But N-acetylcysteine also stabilizes ion channels, and it may be its mechanism as being an antidepressant. Subsets of patients, not for everybody, but clearly there's a positive signal of NAC in a significant number of patients with psychiatric conditions based upon these particular mechanisms. Okay, here's some of the data on NAC for OCD. I'll skip zinc in the interest of time. Magnesium, very essential micronutrient. A lot of people are magnesium deficient. How many of you are on PPIs, pump inhibitors, the Prilosec drugs? Okay, they're not benign drugs. Okay, they produce B12 deficiency and magnesium deficiency. We think that they're benign because the FDA has now cleared them as being OTC drugs, but they're not benign. Okay, and one of their problems that these drugs have is they inhibit magnesium uptake. So a lot of patients are magnesium deficient, and you may never not know that unless you think of the possibility of them being magnesium deficient. But magnesium is a natural calcium channel blocker. It occupies the calcium channel ion pathway to prevent excessive depolarization of calcium or sodium to stabilize neurons. And again, it's not clinically something that is used by itself, but can be used as an augmentation strategy for patients who want something beyond just a pharmaceutical agent. And there's lots of clinical studies on magnesium, including some studies that it helps elderly patients sleep along with melatonin. There are medications, by the way. There's actually a company that's marketing dextromethorphan with quinidine. I'm done. Okay, they're not paying me to give this talk. But actually, one of the mechanisms of how this drug, Nuedexta, works on pseudobulbar palsy is by stabilizing ion channels, particularly calcium channels. A very effective antidepressant in certain subsets of patients. There's ongoing data about that. But again, the key point is that this drug is modulating these ion channels. Like a cardiologist gives a calcium channel blocker for hypertension, we should be thinking as psychiatrists addressing ion channel dysfunction by using biomarkers that help us to identify who those patients are and understanding what drugs and non-pharmaceutical agents act to normalize those ion channels in psychiatry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll take 5 minutes for some quick questions and responses from our two panelists. Anybody want to? Yes, ma'am.
I'm not a doctor and I don't play one narcissist. I have to make that disclaimer. I have a question. Besides the genetics, what is the cause of the ion channel imbalances? Is it affected by thyroid?
Absolutely. So, well, thyroid doesn't necessarily affect ion channels, but progesterone does affect ion channels. So there's actually a lot of data that there's conditions called catamenial disorders, premenstrual syndromes, when progesterone levels are low in particularly women of childbearing age that have migraine exacerbation, psychiatric symptom exacerbation, all due to lower progesterone. Progesterone actually normalizes calcium channels to stabilize them. So it's an example of an environmental or biological factor that's non-genetic that actually contributes to psychopathology based upon abnormal function of those ion channels.
So more prevalent after hysterectomy or not?
After hysterectomy, it probably is less unless a person's taking progesterone post-hysterectomy. But it's more, the catamenial disorders are more prevalent in childbearing age when progesterone levels fluctuate with the menstrual cycle.
Great question, great answer. Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, in terms of the different minerals and vitamins that you mentioned, I work in cardiovascular disease technology information. Underlying depression or dementia or cardiovascular disease risk is systemic inflammation.
Yes.
Drive it.
Yep.
And the diet piece, I think, is more complicated because that's a huge data is that the anti-inflammatory diet is one that is dominated with vegetables and fiber
Right.
Where they are deficient, that's a problem. What the optimal level is, I still can't think of it. Hard to sort through. But I think that most studies that show vitamin replacement don't show benefit. But massive studies in hundreds of thousands of people show that the diet content clearly predicts
Yes.
morbidity, mortality, disability,
And-
brain.
Yes, and the reason is very specific because in nutritional pharmacology, it's not a one-size-fits-all. We can't think of vitamin D being a monotherapy like we think of an SSRI as monotherapy. That's why we see that food content, like eating fish, is actually better than taking omega-3 fish oil because there are other essential fatty acids in fish besides just omega-3. So your point is exactly well taken.
That's great. Makes sense. All right, well, we're going to switch slides here to thank you so much, for both of
Yep.
you. We're very informative. Switch slides here now to Dr. Bill Richards, who is a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University. He's worked for years in psychotherapy research. It's a little bit of back to the future for those of us who are the products of the 60s and 70s and the eras of the hallucinogens. But we want to hear about an update and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, thank you. It's good to be with you all. Thanks to the good organizers of this conference who invited me to contribute. We've got 25 minutes. It's going to go by very fast, but I'm going to do my best here. Initially, let me just acknowledge our team, Roland Griffiths, Matt Johnson, Mary Casamano, Fred Barrett, Al Garcia-Ramo, Derek May, and Annie Umbricht on site at this moment. And our funders, Council on Spiritual Practices, Hefter, the Beckley River Styx, Betsy Gordon Foundations, McCormick Family, Bill Linton, and the National Institutes of Health. I feel like we're really shifting gears radically here. I'm going to take you into kind of a phenomenological, pragmatic approach to the brain or consciousness or the mind or prana kundalini, the life force. Who knows? We really don't know what we are yet. So I begin this with all due humility. But psilocybin, as many of you know, is the psychoactive component of about 180 species of mushrooms growing on our planet. And of course, at Hopkins, we use the synthesized form, so we know the purity and the exact dosage of psilocybin. And these drugs have been around a long time. Some people argue they've been here since 5000 BC. There's anthropological evidence in northern Algeria and peyote buttons in Texas, of all places. So they've emerged and been suppressed and emerged and been suppressed many times throughout the history of our species. The first wave of modern psychedelic research began in the early 1950s with mescaline and continued until 1977, when I actually had the dubious distinction of giving psilocybin to the last cancer patient at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. But in that period, some 40,000 people were treated with psychedelic therapy. There were 1,000 papers published, and there were 6 international conferences. And I'm awed that in the history of science, it was possible for this field to become totally dormant through political and social pressures, propaganda, fears, all kinds of things going on. But it did become dormant from 1977 to 1999, except for one study by Rick Strassman with DMT in New Mexico. And then I am happy to report in 1999, Roland Griffiths and I succeeded in getting all the clearances to restart research. And it's spread from Hopkins now to many other universities, and all of a sudden it's kind of fashionable to do psychedelic research, where before you wouldn't want to touch that, it'll make our university look bad. You know? And so we're really in a new era, and it's very promising and very exciting, and none of us have turned into Timothy Leary yet, and I don't think we're going to. Now, what's so important to understand in this whole wave of research is that we're not talking about a drug effect like giving an SSRI. Rather, these psychedelic molecules seem to give access to a whole range of alternative states of consciousness. And what matters is what is experienced and how it's integrated. So it's the administration of the psilocybin in this case is intricately tied in with quality brief psychotherapy. You have to have a trusting relationship. But what's so remarkable is that the memory of particular states of consciousness, the drug may only be given once, and the memory of that experience seems to have prolonged effects.
Wow.
Now, what does it do in the brain? I don't know. Maybe it wakes up the brain somehow. It adds interconnectivity. You may know Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuit paleontologist, says we're all spiritual beings who are having physical experiences right now. You know, and maybe it awakens us to the so-called spiritual dimension of life, and maybe that's good for the brain and good for health. I won't spend much time on this, but clearly these states of consciousness aren't only triggered by the drugs. They can be triggered by meditative procedures, natural childbirth sometimes, sensory isolation overload, etc. Throughout the whole history of religions, people have had these experiences spontaneously. But what is so unique about psychedelics is that they provide potency, reliability, and safety when skillfully administered. These drugs are non-addictive, they're essentially non-toxic. Physiologically, we know them to be very safe. The dangers are not knowing how to navigate in these inner states. That's how people get into these so-called bad trips. You know, you want to have a good time, and all of a sudden you start reliving the death of your mother, you know. Great therapeutic opportunity, but you have to have the therapeutic support to go through it. And if you try to control and run away from it, you get panicked and paranoid, you know. But this allows us to access these profound states of consciousness in, you know, a 4-hour window in an afternoon, which is very hard to do with meditative techniques alone. I want to tell you about just one of our studies. This was with cancer patients at Hopkins, 51 cancer patients with depression and anxiety, randomized double-blind crossover studies. Everyone got 2 sessions, essentially a placebo and a moderately high dose, 5 weeks between sessions. And after the high dose sessions, there were decreases in depression and anxiety. Many reported loss of a fear of death, coupled with an eagerness to live as fully as possible, and general increases in quality of life. And what's so remarkable is without giving the drug again, at 6-month follow-up, these gains were maintained in 80% of the volunteers. There were 2 other studies at Hopkins at New York and UCLA, total of 92 participants. And they found the same findings, basically, including no one being harmed. Further information for those of you who would like it, go to hefter.org, and you can read the research articles, the press coverage, and there's also descriptions by 8 of the 92 cancer patients, which if I had time, I'd show you one, but we just don't have the time. But you can enjoy them on your own time. And then CSP, the Council on Spiritual Practices, documents the articles that led up to our present studies. At Hopkins now, we've been going 17 years with psilocybin, and we have a number of fascinating studies that are going on. Okay, no such thing as the psychedelic experience, right? But among the many different experiences that can be facilitated, those that are potentially positive are personal psychological experiences, visionary experiences, which by definition include an ego, everyday self that's observing something that's inspiring, and what we call mystical consciousness, which is a unitive state of awareness. There's potentially negative experiences, panic, paranoia, confusion, that essentially don't happen in the research use, the way we have learned to administer these substances. And then there's neutral experiences, the so-called tie-dye t-shirt effect. You know, that's kind of colorful, interesting, but it doesn't contribute to your life, which usually occurs with very low dosage and a good bit of defensiveness and people who wouldn't dare close their eyes, you know. What determines what happens boils down to setting, and dosage. In mental set, above all, trust, interpersonal grounding, courage. Setting, a respectful, secure place. And dosage, we learned in a dose response study that for the average person, in order to access transcendental states of consciousness, you need about 25 milligrams of psilocybin per 70 kilo. If it's less than that, you're likely to have experiences of aesthetic, perceptual change, and maybe some personal psychodynamic insights. But above that, these profound so-called spiritual experiences are more likely. Although it may sound like an excerpt from a medieval list of virtues, rather than modern scientifically grounded guidelines, mental set is of unquestioned importance. We've learned that in the history of psychedelic research. Honesty, trust, courage, genuineness, acceptance facilitate healing experiences. And this has led some to speculate that a basis for ethics may indeed be hardwired into our organisms. The other basic point is that what happens during the period of psilocybin action, when it's done well here, is intrinsically meaningful. There's a wisdom within the psyche that seems to choreograph what happens for a particular person. It's not random, it's not capricious at all. And, you know, I just stand in awe of it, you know? What happens with a patient is inevitably better than anything I could have designed in advance. You know, if I thought, well, what does this person need to experience, you know? The person's own mind has that wisdom. And this is true of all kinds of people. I've given psychedelics to, who knows, maybe 1,000 people in the course of my career. And these are people who have not gone to graduate school. They may not have finished junior high school, but they have these incredibly profound experiences. Wow. This is our lab at Hopkins. The slide crunched it a little bit. But you can see it's very much like a comfortable living room. And our volunteers lie down on nice flannel sheets with stereophonic headphones and eye shades to focus attention within, usually with two therapists to provide whatever support may be needed. Okay, phenomenology of states of consciousness. There's the whole realm of personal psychological insights that's common to psychotherapy, guilt, grief, interpersonal relationships, etc. The wise use of psychedelics can really rapidly accelerate so-called ordinary psychotherapy. But then there's these deep, so-called deeper, more universal states that constitute kind of a new concept in mental health. The idea that the so-called spiritual experiences can really be therapeutic is kind of a new idea. I didn't hear it in graduate school. And there be dragons there, gods. This is Alex Gray's Christ, the Buddha, Kuan Yin, Hindu gods, the wonderful mandala of Eschers of angels and demons, the world of precious stone. Where do these visions come from, you know? I don't have a clue, but they are reliably reported, and people find them incredibly meaningful and inspiring. But then going beyond these visionary encounters is what we call mystical consciousness. And this isn't misty or vague. This is what Maslow called major peak experiences. There's all kinds of religious terms. In Christianity, the beatific vision. In Judaism, sekumutla. In Islam, fana. In Hinduism, samadhi or moksha. In Buddhism, satori. Nirvana, Buddha fields. In Taoism, Wei. Philosophical terms, etc. Aldous Huxley felt it was the source of the perennial or Platonic philosophy. William Miller called it the trigger of quantum change. Many would just say it's a glimpse of enlightenment or waking up. Mystical consciousness includes unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, deeply felt mood, and ineffability. One of our 92 subjects here, her description, early on the visuals came and dissolved so quickly I could not verbalize them in time. Countless variations of what reminded me of the ceiling of Westminster Abbey, Gothic, vaulted, great intricacy. I had no doubt I was in the presence of the infinite because I felt an overriding peacefulness that carried me through everything, even the few seconds of yikes that showed up. I had a sense of losing my observer. I no longer witnessed the images. I was becoming them. My body lit up, all parts in succession, brightest thing I have ever seen. I glowed brilliantly from within, whole being fluttered. I felt I was being breathed through or played like an instrument. Stunningly beautiful. I got that every part of all of us is sacred. There is no speck in the cosmos which is apart from this breath. I am seeing myself in everybody and everybody in myself. Transcendence of time and space. All I can do is offer you some images here. When people experience this, concepts like eternity and infinity make sense. Intuitive knowledge that these experiences are not emotion alone, no matter how glorious the emotion may be, but people feel there's intuitive knowledge that they remember vividly and that has an impact on their behavior. What's known, William James, of course, called this the noetic quality, the reality of God or transcendence, whatever your favorite noun for ultimate reality may be. Edmund Sinnott at Yale used to call God the purposive properties of protoplasm. If you like that, that's fine. The relativity of time, indestructibility of consciousness. Is this a big delusion, or is this really an ontological discovery? Spiritual interconnectedness of us all, what the Hindus call the web of Indra, or in Christianity we call the brotherhood of man. It seems that somehow within consciousness we all are interconnected somehow. Absoluteness of beauty, primacy of love, wisdom, and this whole state of consciousness just feels more real than everyday life. So it's very, very convincing when it happens. Sacredness, just a sense of awe. This is a synagogue in Hungary. This is a Balinese mandala of Shiva, rose windows. Wow. Jeremy Narby has this wonderful theory that what we are experiencing is actually some kind of inner-directed perceptual system, that we're actually perceiving DNA, which allegedly emits photons. And, it sounds pretty schizoid, but can any of us come up with a better explanation? But reliably, people see these incredibly meaningful things. Positive mood, of course, love and peace and all this stuff, and always the claim of ineffability, that human language and human conceptual systems are just too primitive. So if you really want to express this, even though our volunteers always write their research reports for us faithfully, they really say you got to write poetry or compose music or do a painting to really express it. Okay, how do we understand it? Clearly, this is not just another drug-induced high. This is very different from the cocaine or heroin or marijuana high. Is it cognitive impairment? Well, it's a different kind of cognition. It's felt to be a deeper way of knowing. Schizoid flight from reality? Well, it feels like it's going to a deeper substrate of reality. Regression to the womb, I don't know if there's any original Freudians still around, but if it's regression to the womb, there's more going on in that womb than Freud ever thought. Wish fulfillment, result of suggestion, I think we've ruled that out through well-designed experiments where we've standardized expectation. Those who receive Ritalin or nicotinic acid do not have mystical experiences. Those who receive psilocybin do. Reduction of activity in the default mode network, increased neuronal interconnectedness, most likely. Fascinating studies going on at the Imperial College in London and at Hopkins right now of changes in blood flow and so on that correlate with mystical forms of consciousness. But of course, correlation isn't necessarily causation. Is it the religious word is revelation or simply discovery of a spiritual core? Why is it helpful? Time's getting quick here. It leaves people with a sense of awe and gratitude, change in self-concept, your very idea of who you are, what the human organism is changes, change in self-worth, sense of interconnectedness. You can't feel isolated anymore because you have a sense of being bonded with all people, if not all life. Feelings of rebirth and empowerment. This is fascinating because often the cancer patient becomes the family therapist. It's just amazing how, I'm dying, but I'm not dead yet, and we got some things we got to talk about, family. And it's just beautiful, the things that happen, and also reports of new closeness to nature. Okay, next steps are phase 3 multi-site studies of psilocybin in the treatment of depression. These are almost totally finalized at the moment in consultation with the FDA. and we expect to begin those in early 2018, and we will welcome referrals. Most likely it will be 100 cancer patients with a diagnosis of major depression and 100 non-cancer patients. Hopefully that will lead to reclassification of psilocybin off of Schedule 1 or Class A in Europe. We're involved in training providers to implement this. And of course, there's very practical things like how Medicare might cover this in the future. Training opportunities at CIIS, where I have the privilege of teaching in San Francisco. And Compass Pathways is overseeing the phase 3 studies in Europe, in USONA Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, the studies in the United States, and I will also mention MAPS, which is primarily looking at MDMA right now. And finally, let me plug my own book. If I could say more, it's in there. It just came out 10 days ago in audio book form. But it's not expensive, and I think if you're interested in this field, you'd find it useful. I thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Very delightful. Very delightful. And thanks for raising our consciousness and awareness here. So we have about 5 minutes for some questions. Ma'am.
Wondering if you were aware or familiar with some of the literature on research of near-death experience survivors.
Near-death experiences.
Near-death experience, survivors of near-death who were arrested, who were near-death, resuscitated. Because a lot of the issues
Yes.
psilocybin are benefits. There's long-term studies of radical change in quality of life, like perception, very positive change.
Right.
Lives that are long enduring. I guess when the reality of death is there and cherish life for your perspectives of what's important is what's love and learning and those things. It's very similar.
Yes. Yes, the phenomenology of near-death experiences is very similar to many psychedelic experiences, kind of going through tunnels, meeting beings of light, feeling inspired in one way or another. So it may be similar terrain. Yeah. And also the after effects. Yes, sir. Wonderful question. Ayahuasca, used by 3 religions in Brazil. Sunday morning you go and you have your ayahuasca experience, contains DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is very similar to the psilocybin molecule. And actually, supposedly our own bodies generates DMT. It's maybe in lung tissue. They're not sure exactly where right now. So folks, we're all in violation of federal law by virtue of being human. And but DMT in ayahuasca seems to, I think of DMT and psilocybin, frankly, as 2 different skeleton keys that give access to the same range of experiences. I think if we did a double-blind study, there'd be just as many anacondas and panthers in both groups. Yeah.
Interesting. Others, sir.
Is there a compassionate use for physicians who have patients, instead of enrolling a patient in a study, like for an FDA rapid approval?
Not yet, but it may be coming. The FDA has been very helpful, cooperative with us in designing the phase 3 studies. And also the same thing is happening in Europe with the EMA. The European Medicines Agency has been very cooperative in finalizing the research designs. So we'll see. We've got some work to do before we have the research results, but...
So are there some guidelines that you, as you administer this, that you particularly advise the clinicians about?
There's certain medical screening in terms, we would screen out at this point anyone who's genetically loaded for schizophrenia or has a history of psychosis. We would screen out anyone with an acute heart condition or renal condition, anyone with a brain tumor. But other than that, all our evidence says that psilocybin is really very safe for the average person if you know what you're doing, you know?
Okay. Well, very much appreciated.
Yeah,
Another round of applause for our presenters and for you all. Thank you for a most enjoyable afternoon.
Likewise.